My name is Harold Whitman, and I am 84 years old. When people talk about winter, they usually mean cold mornings, snow on the ground, and shorter days. But the winter I am thinking about, the longest winter of my life, was more than just a season. It was a time, a feeling, a stretch of days that seemed to have no end, where every morning felt heavier than the one before, and every night carried the same quiet question: how much longer? It began the year my wife, Elena, died. She had been my companion for 61 winters. 61 times we had watched the first frost settle on the windows. 61 times we had pulled out our heavy coats and joked about how they seemed to get heavier every year. 61 times we had sat together in the evenings, her knitting in her lap, my newspaper folded beside me, the radio humming softly in the background. Winter had always meant warmth to me because she was there. And then, suddenly, she was. The house felt different the moment I walked back into it after the funeral. Colder, even though the heater was running. Larger, even though nothing had moved. Every room carried an echo of her, her slippers by the door, her scarf hanging on the coat rack, the faint smell of her soap still lingering in the bathroom. I remember standing in the hallway, not knowing where to go, as if the house itself had become unfamiliar without her in it. That was when winter truly began for me. Outside, the snow fell like it always did, soft and steady, covering the world in white. But inside, something else was settling, a silence so deep it felt like it had weight. I moved through my days slowly, doing the things that needed to be done because they had always been done. Making tea in the morning, washing dishes after meals, straightening cushions no one else would sit on. I spoke to her sometimes out of habit. "I'll be right back, Ellie," I'd say when I went to the kitchen. Or, "Did you see that?" When something caught my eye on television. Each time, I'd realize a moment too late that there would be no answer. People told me time would help, that winter would pass, that spring would come again. But that year, it felt as though winter had decided to stay. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The snow outside melted and returned, but the cold inside me never quite left. I slept in the chair more often than in our bed because lying there alone felt unbearable. I kept her side just as she had left it, pillows untouched, blanket folded carefully as if she might still come back and need it. I wasn't living, not really. I was waiting. Waiting for the door to open, for her voice to call my name, for the world to make sense again. But winter does not answer when you ask it how long it plans to stay. Waiting became the shape of my days. I waited for morning to come so I could say I had made it through another night. I waited for evening so I could finally rest, even though I knew rest would not come easily. I waited for the sound of the phone, for a knock at the door, for anything that might pull me out of the stillness that had settled over my life. Most days, nothing did. The world outside kept moving. I could see it through the windows, neighbors shoveling snow from their driveways, children bundled up in bright coats, pulling sleds behind them, their laughter drifting faintly through the cold air. Cars passing, lights glowing in the early darkness of winter afternoons. Life was still happening, all around me. It just felt very far away, as if I were watching it from the other side of thick glass. Inside, I moved slowly through rooms that were full of memories. Every corner of that house held a piece of Alina. The kitchen where she used to hum while she cooked, always slightly off-key, always smiling when she caught me listening. The little table by the window where she drank her tea each afternoon, staring out as if she were waiting for the world to tell her a story. The armchair near the fireplace, worn and soft from years of use, where she would sit in the evenings, a blanket over her knees, her knitting needles clicking softly as the radio played. Sometimes I would sit in that chair and close my eyes, imagining she was still there. I could almost hear the soft sound of her breathing, almost feel the warmth of her beside me. For a few seconds, if I held very still, it felt real. And then I would open my eyes, and the chair would be empty again, and the ache would return, sharp and sudden, like cold air rushing into my lungs. I told myself it was better to feel it than to feel nothing at all. At night, the house was the hardest. The silence grew louder when the world outside settled down. The ticking of the clock in the hallway seemed to echo through every room, marking each second that passed without her. I tried to sleep in our bed at first, lying on my side, facing the empty space where she used to be. But after a while, it became too much. I moved to the chair in the living room, wrapping myself in a blanket, letting the faint glow of the streetlight through the window keep me company. It wasn't comfortable, but it felt safer somehow, like I was closer to the world, less alone. I dreamed of her often. Sometimes she was young, the way she looked when we first met, her hair dark and her eyes bright, teasing me for being nervous. Sometimes she was just as she had been at the end, thin and tired, but smiling at me with that same gentle look she always had when she wanted to tell me everything would be all right. In the dreams, she never spoke. She didn't need to. She was just there. And when I woke up, the emptiness felt even heavier than before. Friends and family tried to help. They called. They stopped by with casseroles and kind words and careful smiles. They told me stories to make me laugh. They asked if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping, if I needed anything. I thanked them, told them I was fine, because it felt easier than trying to explain what fine meant now. After a while, the visits became less frequent, not because they didn't care, but because life pulled them back to their own routines. I understood. I didn't blame them. But each time the door closed behind them, the house seemed a little quieter than before. The winter outside was a harsh one that year. Storm after storm rolled through, covering the world in thick layers of snow. Some mornings I woke up to find the windows frosted over, the world beyond blurred and distant. I would stand there with my mug of coffee, watching as the wind pushed snow across the street, and I would think, it looks the way I feel. Cold, white, endless. I stopped keeping track of the days. The calendar on the wall still showed dates, but they no longer meant much to me. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they all felt the same. Just another stretch of hours to get through, just another night to survive. I wasn't looking forward to anything. I was just waiting for time to pass, hoping that somehow, without me noticing, the pain would grow smaller. But pain does not fade when you refuse to look at it. It sits, it waits, it grows heavier the longer you carry it without setting it down. One afternoon, weeks after Alina's passing, I found myself standing in the bedroom doorway, staring at her closet. I hadn't opened it since she died. Not once. The door was closed, as if that thin piece of wood could keep everything inside untouched. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the way the light fell across it. Maybe it was the simple fact that I was tired of pretending it wasn't there. Whatever the reason, I reached out and pulled it open. Her clothes hung neatly inside, just as she had left them. Coats, dresses, sweaters she loved to wear in winter. The faint scent of her perfume drifted out, and for a moment my legs felt weak. I leaned against the doorframe, breathing it in, letting it carry me back. I reached out and touched the sleeve of one of her sweaters, soft beneath my fingers, and suddenly I couldn't hold it in anymore. I sank down onto the bed and cried. Not quiet tears, not the kind you wipe away quickly and pretend aren't there. These were deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere I hadn't let myself visit since the day she died. My chest hurt. My head throbbed. My hands clenched the fabric as if I could somehow hold on to her through it. I cried for everything we had been, for everything we would never be, for the long winters ahead that she would never see. When it finally passed, when my body could no longer keep it up, I sat there, exhausted, tears drying on my face, the room silent again. But something felt different, lighter somehow. As if, for the first time, I had set down a small part of the weight I'd been carrying. That was the first crack in that long winter. I didn't know it then. I just knew that I felt empty, and yet, strangely, a little more alive. After that afternoon in the bedroom, I didn't suddenly feel better. Grief doesn't work that way, but something had shifted. It was as if a door inside me, one I had kept tightly shut, had opened just enough to let a little air in. The pain was still there, heavy and familiar, but now it moved instead of sitting like a stone in my chest. I could feel it, and feeling I was beginning to understand meant I was still alive. The days that followed were different in small ways. I still made my coffee in the morning, still sat by the window watching the snow drift past, still spoke to Alina out of habit. But I also found myself doing things I hadn't done in weeks. I opened the curtains wider to let in more light. I washed the blanket I had been sleeping with in the chair and made the bed again, even if I didn't climb into it right away. I stepped outside to shovel the walkway instead of waiting for a neighbor to do it for me. These were not big changes. No one else would have noticed them. But to me, they felt like tiny declarations. I am still here. I can still move. I began to walk again. At first, it was only to the end of the street and back. The cold air burned my lungs, and my legs complained with every step, but I welcomed it. It reminded me that my body still had work to do, that I wasn't just waiting to fade away. The snow made everything look quiet and clean, and I found myself paying attention to things I had ignored for years. The way frost clung to bare branches, the crunch of ice under my boots, the pale winter sun that seemed to hover low in the sky, as if it too were tired. One morning, as I was walking past the small park near my house, I stopped at a bench half covered in snow. Elena and I used to sit there in warmer months, watching children play and talking about nothing in particular. I brushed off the snow and sat down, my breath rising in little clouds. The park was empty, but I could almost hear her voice beside me, commenting on the cold, teasing me for not wearing a warmer coat. I smiled at the thought, and instead of feeling only sadness, I felt something else too, a gentle warmth. The memory no longer cut as sharply as it once had. It still hurt, but it also comforted me. That surprised me. I had been so afraid that letting myself feel her absence would break me completely. But sitting there on that cold bench, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before. Showing my grief hadn't destroyed me, hiding it had. Letting the tears come, letting the memories rise, letting myself speak her name out loud. All of it made the weight easier to carry. Not gone, just lighter. At home, I started to sort through small things, not everything. I wasn't ready for that. But I opened a drawer here, a box there, old letters, receipts from trips we'd taken, birthday cards she had saved for reasons only she understood. I sat at the table and read them slowly, smiling at some, wiping my eyes at others. With each one, I told confirming myself that I wasn't erasing her. I was honoring her. There was a difference, even if it took me time to see it. One afternoon, I found a small notebook tucked behind a stack of papers in the study. It was Elena's. I recognized her handwriting immediately, neat and careful, the way she always wrote grocery lists and little reminders. Inside were pages of thoughts, not poems exactly, just reflections, little notes to herself about days she didn't want to forget, about things she was grateful for, about hopes she still carried, even as her health began to fail. I read every page. On one of the last ones, written in a shakier hand, she had written, "Harold, don't stop living when I'm gone. Promise me you'll keep going even if it's hard. Find the small joys. They matter more than you think." I sat there with that notebook in my hands for a long time, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes again. This time, though, the tears were different. They weren't just from loss. They were from love, from the sudden, painful, beautiful reminder that she had been thinking of me even then, that she had known how hard this would be and had tried, in her own quiet way, to leave me a light to follow. "I'll try," I whispered into the empty room. "I don't know how yet, but I'll try." From that day on, I carried those words with me. The winter outside was still long. The snow kept coming. The days were still short and cold. But inside me, something was slowly beginning to thaw. I could feel it in the way I looked forward, just a little, to my morning walks, in the way I noticed the smell of coffee again, instead of just drinking it without thinking, in the way I caught myself humming sometimes the same old tune Alina used to love, before realizing I was doing it at all. I wasn't healed. I wasn't suddenly whole again. But I was no longer just waiting. I was beginning, in my own slow way, to let go. Letting go, I learned, is not a single moment. It is not a door you open once and then walk through forever. It is a series of small choices, made again and again, even on days when you don't feel strong enough to make them. Some mornings, I woke up feeling almost steady, ready to face the day. Other mornings, the weight returned, heavy and sudden, and I would sit on the edge of the bed wondering how I had managed to fool myself into thinking things were getting easier. On those days, I reminded myself of Alina's words. Find the small joys. They matter more than you think. So I looked for them, even when my heart resisted. Sometimes the small joy was just sunlight breaking through the clouds, catching on the frost outside my window and turning it into something that sparkled. Sometimes it was the sound of a neighbor's radio drifting faintly through the wall, a song I hadn't heard in years. Sometimes it was the simple fact that I had made it through another night and was still here to see the morning. These were not grand things, but they were enough to carry me through the hours. As winter wore on, I found myself talking to people again. Not long conversations at first, just a few words exchanged while shoveling snow. A nod and a smile to the woman who walked her dog past my house every afternoon. A short chat with the cashier at the grocery store. It felt awkward, like using muscles I hadn't stretched in a long time. But each small interaction reminded me that I was still part of this world, still seen, still able to reach out beyond the walls of my home. One afternoon, while I was sitting on that same bench in the park, wrapped in my coat and watching the bare trees sway in the wind, a man about my age sat down beside me. He didn't say anything at first. We just sat there, two old men sharing the cold. After a few minutes, he nodded toward the snow and said, "Feels like winter's been going on forever this year." I smiled faintly. "It does," I replied. And somehow that simple exchange opened the door. We talked for a while after that. About the weather, about our aches and pains, about how different the world feels when you've been in it for a long time. He told me his name was Frank and that he had lost his wife the year before. I told him about Elena. We didn't offer each other solutions. We didn't need to. We just listened. And when we stood up to leave, he clapped me gently on the shoulder and said, "Good to talk to someone who understands." It was. It really was. After that, we started meeting there once or twice a week, whenever the weather allowed. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just sat in silence, watching the world go by. Both felt good. Both felt like proof that even in grief, new connections can grow, slow and quiet, like shoots pushing up through frozen ground. The snow outside began to thin as the weeks passed. Patches of dark pavement showed through. The piles at the edges of the street shrank a little each day. I noticed it without thinking one morning as I stepped outside for my walk. The air still held a bite, but there was something different in it. A hint of softness. A promise, maybe, that this long season would not last forever. That morning I walked a little farther than usual, past the park, past the familiar houses, down a street Elena and I used to take on our evening strolls years ago. My legs ached, my breath came faster, but I kept going, showing myself that I could. When I finally turned back, I felt tired, but also proud. Proud that I had gone farther than I thought I could. Proud that I hadn't turned back at the first sign of discomfort. It was a small victory, but it meant more to me than I could explain. At home, I sat in my chair by the window, looking out at the melting snow, and thought about what letting go really meant. For a long time, I had believed it meant forgetting, leaving Elena behind, pretending our life together was finished and no longer mattered. That idea had terrified me. It still did. But now, slowly, I was beginning to see that letting go was something else entirely. It was accepting that she was not coming back, while still carrying her with me. It was learning to live in a world that no longer had her physical presence, while letting her love shape the way I moved through it. It was opening my hands, not to drop her memory, but to make room for whatever else life still had to offer. That afternoon, I took Alina's notebook from the drawer again and read her words once more. Find the small joys. They matter more than you think. I closed it gently and held it to my chest for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the weight of her. And then I placed it back in the drawer, not as something to hide away, but as something I knew would always be there when I needed it. Outside, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. The last patches of snow glowed faintly in its light. Winter was still here, but I could see its edges now. I could feel, deep down, that it was loosening its hold. And for the first time since Elena had died, I allowed myself to believe that one day, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not even soon, but one day, I would wake up and feel something like spring inside me again.